Welcome to another author chat with Studio Potter. Today, we are here with Erin Shafkind, who wrote Reclaiming the Potter. And in that article, she interviewed Courtney Leonard and Paul Briggs and had just a great conversation with them. And that article has been the article that we've made free for everyone all month long. And you have a few more days to log in and read that before it goes behind the paywall at studiopotter.org. So I hope you get a chance to read it, and if not, become a member, and then you can read all of the wonderful stories in our archives. But thank you all for joining us today. And could you just introduce yourselves real quick? Erin, let's start with you.
I'm Erin Shafkind. I'm in Seattle. And in Seattle, I teach, I make art, and occasionally I write about art and artists. And I'm glad to be here.
I'm Courtney Michelle Leonard, and I am joining you from Dakota Territory in Minnesota. I just joined the Faculty of Art and Art History at St. Olaf College, and I'm originally from Long Island, New York, and my nation is Shinnecock.
Hello, everyone. Great to join you in conversation. And my name is Paul Briggs, and I teach art education at the Massachusetts College of Art. And I am about 40 minutes outside of Boston in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And I'm in my studio.
I appreciate you all being here.
I thought about this idea a little more broadly because I am in art education. But I think ceramics suffers from the same way of going about teaching art. I think we maybe, I don't know, maybe you'll know whether or not the field is getting better. There's another thing happening in ceramics, but let me try and let it. I think in art education in general, that we have taught the canon for so long that when you go into art classrooms, you still see the same lineup of artists. There's always a Picasso on the wall, right? There's always a Mary Cassatt on the wall. You know, there's just, where there are so many artists out there which could and should be included. Now I see something happening in ceramics right now where we're kind of doing the same thing. You know, there always was a Volkis, right? There always was a Karen Carnes, even if Carnes was included, right? So there was always that same canon of those represented artists. I've been trying to find a new word for masterworks, right? I'm always asking my students to come up with something. We've been saying popular works, or better known works, or well-known works. But we need to come up with a better way of saying that. The reason why this is so important, so in Clay to Culture, there was another thing that happened, and maybe Courtney can relate to this, right? Beside the Picasso, you always have also the Aboriginal painting. So we very easily also include an ethnicity or a culture, as opposed to an underrepresented group, in the United States. So in Clay to Culture, I think, I don't know, maybe I suffered from that same way of thinking, because we were featuring a Peruvian potter. It was very easily to talk about that type of representation and inclusion. But when we think about how we got here, there's a book called White on Black, by Jan Netterveen Peters, images of Blacks in Western popular culture. And it talks about the many derogatory images and where they appeared. So I guess I just call it Aunt Jemima's syrup. I mean, what is the syrup company just decided to remove Aunt Jemima from the syrup? Okay. Um, Vanity Fair just featured Breonna Taylor. Now, it was, I don't know which magazine it was. So I'm not saying this was Vanity Fair, but there was a magazine when I was doing my doctoral work in 1995 that said we would put more images of women of color on the front of our magazine if our sales didn't go down. If you had just taken the hit, which I don't know, it was probably not, maybe the CEO would have taken it, made $1 million less. But if you had just taken the hit then, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in. So in Peters's book, he looks at postcards, cereal boxes. So every facet of society has to be responsible for wielding the power of images responsibly. So whether you're in the ceramics classroom, the art history classroom, wherever you are, every time a student comes into contact with a powerful image, it's going to make a difference in how we live and how we move and our way of being in this society. So I think we're getting better, but oh so slowly. We are so behind the times. And I'll just mention this quickly. IKEA very early on was so inclusive in their representation in their little catalog. And I was like, oh, I'm going to shop at IKEA just because. And I just think if people had early on, the kind of attention we're seeing now everywhere should have been always. But the art classroom is especially poised to do that. We deal in images. And in ceramics is no different. We've also included the canon, and we should definitely branch out, but not fall into the trap of including the same group of people of color also in shows and exhibitions and everywhere. We can't move forward unless we leave no one behind.
Speaking of IKEA, it brought do you remember the United Colors of Benetton?
Yes.
Right? That was, that just zoomed into my head. I do notice it in like the last 2 issues of Ceramics Monthly that have come to my house, and in Craft in America, that magazine, that there is way more inclusive. I think the thing is, can it continue and make it a sustainable, permanent change of inclusion? And I like that you said it can't be just like the same, even when it's being representing people from all walks of life, it can't just be the same usual suspects from one culture or another. I think that's great. So
yeah, I had someone include me recently, who contacted me recently about a show and said, we want your help with this show, but we don't want you to be in the show. And I was like, all right, I get it. They said we're trying to go here, and I was like, I get it. I'm fine, but we're going to have to be that way. We're going to. I think we have to do this work. If we don't sustain it, then it won't be sustained. There's another generation that has to be influenced by an inclusive representation.
I think when the field tends to want to have conversations that include different perspectives, in that regard being Indigenous communities, to a certain degree, contemporary artists who are Indigenous within the field, it tends to still be typecast or separated and not included across the board in terms of human perspective, contemporary perspective, who we are today as a people. I think the other thing to acknowledge is that I, in particular, am from the Shinnecock Nation in Long Island, New York, and that we are not all one Indigenous people. So I think in that regard, there's still a lot of work for humanity as a whole, to understand the individuality of who we are as artists, and then who we are as artists from our respective communities and culture and relation. I also think that when I wrote that article for that magazine, it was just kind of looking at language, and that's a strong part of my work, is how we tend to use, for myself in particular, I come from a community where we don't have a fluid speaking language. We're still going through the process of language revitalization in terms of the imposition of English. But if you take one word from the English language, it sometimes have multiple different definitions that you can enter into that word. But as a society, we tend to use words in a very strongly, like, one way of using that definition. And I would probably say that is akin to indigeneity within the field, is that we're still using an idea of indigenous or authentic or Native American that is only holding to one component of that definition and is not expanding upon all of its layers and community and the people that are active within this field, who I think, along with what Paul had shared, are not being acknowledged because they don't fit society's idea of what that definition should be. So there's been some change, but I'm a little bit bothered that the change is fitting the identity that people seek, fitting the aesthetic that people seek within the work. And if you don't show your identity very apparently in your work, then it's not understood as being diverse or being indigenous or being authentic. And therefore it often does not get shown or get seen. And in that regard, I think that that is problematic in this day and age of wokeness, is I wonder what the intention is of inclusivity, if it's just to check a box, and that box has to have that aesthetic. And if it was different, then we would have a lot more broader voices being heard in this field, rather than the people that are fitting that aesthetic. And it's nothing against that work. It's just that when it becomes held up in the majority, it becomes problematic as to why. What is the intention of the field when this is the only voice that is being heard over and over again, and then being asked to curate over and over again? And then to a certain degree, there's a clique being developed of diversity, and that clique of diversity, whether it's meant to or not, is also being exclusive. So it's kind of a bit of irony, or it's doing the opposition of what the intention might have been, is that it's continuing to silo voices. It's continuing to leave out voices and add to invisibility. And that was never my hope for this. So it's a little bit problematic when you set out 20 years ago to want more people to be seen. And then so you're happy, you're glad that there's a broader amount of people being included, but then you're like, wait a minute, this is a little bit too much of the same. And I know that it makes me wonder, it's like, wow, is this just appeasing somebody's appetite without really giving a lot of different meals at the table, or I don't know, just food for thought, things of that nature. So, and I think when I am working with younger students now, in terms of 20 years before and 20 years now where I'm at, I think that's what more of our young people want, is to be heard, and not to be heard under this definition that people are accepting them in, but to be heard in their essence and their wholeness. And that, I hope, would be my next 20 year, maybe not even 20 year. Can't we just do it tomorrow? Like, why does it have to take so long to move through these things that are simple? I think they're simple in my mind. They're a little bit more complicated in other people in terms of how long they take to just be equitable.
Thank you so much for that, Courtney. And Erin, I wondered, did you have Did a question come up in your mind or something that you wanted to interject or add to points that were raised just then?
In a way, with both Paul and Courtney, and I'm an educator as well, and I teach in the public school system. So I'm the person whose classroom you might come into, and I adamantly don't show certain artists on the walls, like with what Paul mentioned. I'm in my 23rd year, and when I was a younger teacher, there was the canon of mainly, and I call them the WMD because they're white, male, and dead artists. And students don't usually know my reference to the WMD, but which are also not a real thing in a way. But I so appreciate just what both artists were talking about in terms of how do we lift voice and show and continually show and like almost never stop sharing what can be representation. I have this thing that I say a lot: who do you amplify and why? Who do you amplify and why? And that can be in many directions. For a long time, I thought I was going to write an article that was why I don't write about, name of white, or actually, I don't even know if you presented as white. If Picasso presented as white, but he was European, male, and at that top echelon, and, womanizer, all that stuff. But I thought I was going to write an article at one point that was why I don't write about name, right? Because I think there's so much that art education can do for the general public. But more and more, and even with this essay that I thought it was going to be about something, I thought I was going to key into these particular ideas, but when I talked with both Paul and Courtney before writing, I realized I was coming from a place of scarcity as well. I was coming from some place that was like, oh, I'm going to show this thing, but then in the end, I didn't have to. I could show just this other abundant idea. And I was super grateful after both of the conversations, but I spoke to Paul first and then I spoke to Courtney, and it really turned in my heart that I didn't have to use this other idea that was more about scarcity and not about the abundance of like life and ideas and culture and so many ways to approach aesthetic.
I think thinking out of a place of richness and abundance is definitely a different approach. To say that, we have a richness and an abundance that we can share with our students is a great way of thinking about it, because we're all going to be, in a play on words, enriched by this inclusion. There's, in so many ways, everything gets improved. And again, some of the companies are starting to realize that, well, you know what, as Dr. King said, yes, we're separate, we're not so wealthy, but if you combine all of our money together, and he's thinking about blacks, and if you just include everyone, people of color, then the companies, the society will benefit and the companies will benefit as well. As I said, I'm ready to, I'll get something for my kids just because they're trying. And you know what, that particular, everyone's buying the Breonna Taylor cover from Vanity Fair, and there was so much inclusion in the issue. I haven't even gotten through it yet, but we are enriched. Everyone is, by this greater inclusion. It's not for a lack of resources, is it? It's just because we haven't been intentional about it. We have to be very intentional about it. So.
It made me, Erin, when you said that who are you amplifying and why? It reminded me of a question I used to put to my students when I was teaching, that what paradigm, what unknown paradigm are you agreeing to that you don't have to, that it's like holding you back? But it's these invisible agreements that we've made, right? Like these constructs that we're operating under that we don't even realize it. And I think what's so great, I can just see Courtney and Paul reading your conversations with Erin and just talking to you now, that it's to like have someone in your council, in your circle of friends that can help you break the plate you don't even know you're eating from.
I'd actually like to, just when Courtney was talking, I thought of this fellow when I was at a summer camp who used to do what we called Native American Night. But you know, he did a really good job. He used to talk about the 3 groups of Native Americans who were in the area. And he did a good job. The kids, the kids would dress up, but they would dress up differently for each group. They would share a story differently from each group. He really distinguished well the difference between and the nuances of each group. So out of a richness, and I know Courtney was about to follow up on that particular conversation that was on the floor. I would love to hear what you had on your mind if it hasn't escaped you.
It's hard for me to enter into that question without acknowledging that I, to each his own in terms of like their perspective, but for myself, I don't use Native American, and I tend to use like indigenous, and more specifically like our nation. And I think that when I was listening to Erin, and what I appreciated about this conversation was the notion of intent, but with openness. So there was an intent thought of in having this conversation about the pot and all of the maybe shards per se of bringing us together and what that vessel was. But then it became open. And I think that's what I really appreciated about this interview and the writing, was that I got to be Courtney in all of my essence, and I got to have a conversation that wasn't looking for something to fit some sort of answer, and that was, I think we talked for maybe 2 hours or something, Erin, I think, because I think that's something that I don't get offered often. I get offered very much a leading question, or I think Paul had mentioned when you get asked to curate, but in that regard, it might not be with all of your freedom and your knowledge and your layers of who you are and what you know. My background is very strongly also in marine sciences and museum studies, and that integration and social dynamics and climate change, but not because it's popular right now, because it's actually affecting our community and receding the coastline. There's an immediacy to the conversations that are being had within the work. And that often doesn't get acknowledged when someone has a leading intention for the writing or for the exhibition or for whatever it is that they're coming into that now decides it's going to be highlighted in ceramics in particular or in other areas. So upon listening to Erin, I think that was something I wanted to also, the act of intention to a certain degree, but still remaining open on the journey was really key to this and what I appreciated about this moment together. And then just the moment of, just the notion of being acknowledged. And that was, that is something that I think is truly important. When you can go into a room and you say someone's name versus not saying their name, or mispronouncing their name, or just acknowledgement and presence, I think is some of the most key components of humanity and being human with one another. Yeah, I think in terms of when, so my daughter is going to be 10 this week. It's hard for me not to acknowledge her in terms of my learning of representation. There is a cartoon on PBS called Molly from Denali. I know some of the directors for that cartoon, and they're incorporating language and community and relationship to elders, specifically to Alaska, Athabasca, and Inupiaq territory and Inuit, and that's great. Although she's 10, so she doesn't really want to watch a younger PBS show. And then being here in Minnesota, which Mini in Dakota is the water, and Soda is the gray sky or the haze, and that coming together is acknowledging that specific community. When we were watching television last night, I got to watch a Ojibwe language program being highlighted. I got to watch another, wild ricing, and that's specific to the Ojibwe community. And in that regard, she wanted to know why we were watching this on a Saturday night. But for me, I was like, this is not something your father and I grew up with. This is not an opportunity that we have had, that you and your generation is starting to have, should have more visibility. It is not specific like her nation being Shinnecock, but there are Indigenous conversations being acknowledged in their individuality in terms of representation. And so that was something that I was like, that's why we're watching it on a Saturday night. So it's like.
My third question, I think it's really was convoluted, but I just always wonder about this, that, and I guess it is coming from me, I'm being shy now about it being too leading with my own agenda, but it's just that objects can, it's just, so take it as a starting point. But when the work is about so much more, I guess I'll just tell you, like, I personally feel like with social issues that at some point the objects have to go away. Like there have to be people in rooms, like if it brings attention to a conversation, then like that's its, for me, that's its number one job. But then the object has to leave and it has to be about people doing the work. And I just wondered, because you both are doing works that are so, and Erin, you do too, work that like wants the world to be better, is asking the world to be better, is asking the world to think about hard things. And where do you fall with the role of the object in your practice and in your hope for a better world?
I actually don't know if the question works. I think we just have to make things. And it goes back to Courtney talking about, does the maker have to make a representation of themselves that's on the nose, like of culture or of identity? I for the longest time, and I'm Jewish, and tomorrow's Yom Kippur. I just want to acknowledge it's a really neat day to reflect on this last year, and reflect on all the things we've done or thought or haven't done, and so for the longest time I thought, oh, do I need to be making, Judaic symbols? Do I need to represent my people? Do I need to do this? And I actually tried it. I go in and out. And I have come to, and this came up with something, and to me, both of you, Courtney and Paul, do this, that your work like fully represents you. But I also feel like there isn't this sense in looking right at the work of a specific symbol related to indigeneity or related to Blackness. I don't know that, if that makes sense. I just believe we make things, and we hopefully can learn and be and discuss and go in with intention and try to be open and curious and adaptable and flexible and multiple, like emerge in multiple ways, so that there's not a limitation. And then in that community, we are better. We become more, we become better. There was some interesting things in my community here with people going, why do we have to keep having these conversations? And they were troubled. They didn't want to be troubled, and they wanted to acknowledge the civil unrest but I kept thinking, I have to leave this community, but more and more I realized, and this was just a particular group of people, I realized, no, I don't. I just have to be me and go with whatever I feel the need to go with, that's hopefully amplifying in a way that's not about the dominant culture. And I can still be something in these communities. I can still hopefully connect. There's a really neat group of people who are looking at Octavia Butler's writing, and whenever I can throw out Octavia Butler, I'm going to do it. And I ended my story with a quote from her. But they have the 7 steps. They talk about the 7 steps to shape change, and I'm just going to tell you what they are really fast. Self-love, self-care, belief, observation, community, teach, create. And if we're in those, we are shaping change. And that comes from Octavia Butler through Monica A. Coleman and Tananarive Due.
Paula, Courtney, do you want to add to that in any way?
I don't know that I'm trying to be Black. You know?
I just have to let you hear me laugh at that.
So I guess I'm saying I get what Erin's saying. I don't know that, I don't know that like Courtney's trying to be indigenous, with the work. I am Black, and I'm responding to the world around me, compelled to do so. I've been saying, I'm really kind of, as far as aesthetics concerned, it's really kind of really philosophical, I just love talking about, definitely how we value beauty, but that conversation, even aesthetics as valuing beauty, is a Western conversation because of the mess we have ourselves in, right? We wouldn't be having, aesthetics wouldn't be so rooted in axiology, in values, if we weren't in the mess that we're in. So I've been saying beauty is in the ideology of the beholder. And I would rather just be making work that is just about my own exploration of the aesthetics of a process. But I can't, there's just something bubbling up inside me or bubbling up outside of me that pushes this other work out. And I do believe images are very powerful. I believe every image makes a difference. And I think we know this intuitively, or else we would not have put derogatory images on postcards, on cereal boxes, on syrup, on houses of worship. It's everywhere. A philosophical idea or a racist idea, it bubbles out to the general public as images. Remember when the Puritans were doing all the things that they were doing to every group they could, a lot of the population couldn't read. There's a book by Ann Kibbe called The Interpretation of Material Shapes in Puritanism. And it talks about a picturesque language that was used. Come on, we see it in politics. That fellow in the White House is always dropping a language, a word that represents something that people see in their head. Always happening. And images are very powerful, whether they're images in words, how words are rolled out. And these kind of conversations around images also become very, very important. You know, I've learned so much already. Or something that I knew really gets pricked into me when we're open and honest with each other, right? You, you know, sometimes you got to hear something. This is one of my person I used to work with used to say you got to hear it 5 times in 5 different ways before it's, you know, before it really sinks into you, before you're really able to embrace that and be different. So yeah, I'm not trying to create work to say that I have to. I'm just compelled to, for myself first, and then yes, I believe it. I believe this, all this work, where it screams at you or not. And, you know, James Baldwin, you know, he said if we're going to talk about these issues, if it's going to first be with art, because art is going to get in there in a way that other ways of presenting this just can't get to it. So.
Courtney, did you have something to add?
I don't know. I think immediately I was thinking about the intimacy of decay. My most recent work is at the Dartmouth, the Hood Museum of Art, and it's Breach Logbook 20, focused on logging a visual account of 2020 and specifically looking at ghost traps, or the traps that are left behind that the whales are getting caught in as they migrate up the eastern coast, and our relation in terms of man-made artifice and detritus that's left behind as it flows from the Wilder Dam, which is close to Dartmouth's campus, and down the Connecticut River, and then our relation in terms of that Connecticut River opening up into Long Island Sound. And when I was weaving those works, because my work is coiling, so I think that's the other thing that I've realized in terms of object and objectivity within this field, is that if I had presented a conversation to a certain degree on, let's say, the form of our traditional vessel from our community, being that of a seed pot similar to Jomon pottery or Ecuadorian pottery, the language of that form is not understood within this community. And it would take a longer time to have it be acknowledged than if I were to complicate the weave or complicate the coil into structures that people second guess. Is that clay? Is that something that you could do with that material? Is it dipped wire? No, it's not. And then thinking through the layers that the material affords in glazes and surfaces to emphasize and echo the decay of a trap as it is weathering and wearing away and tossed and turned in the ocean. The intimacy of decay lends to beauty, but you have to pause, you have to take a moment, and often I will use my phone a lot to take photographs, and I find that the process of taking a photograph enables a pause, and that's something that we often don't do. We don't have enough time sometimes for ourselves, or offer that to ourselves during our day, to just stop and take a moment and look through a lens and have an intimate experience with the layers. And when I was thinking about the surfaces, man, there were some really beautiful ugly, or ugly beautiful, or just this like the word beautiful or English just doesn't serve the possibility of observation when you're looking at your landscape and you're responding. And that was something that I journeyed with as I was developing the work that was installed in Nebulous, or maybe to a certain degree why I create an environment as an installation artist, is it goes to my personal experience. People don't lend enough time to listen to who I am and where I come from. And that is why I tend to have 50 objects in a space. Is if I offer just one, would you spend the time just alone with one object to question and discover all of its essence? If I give you an abundance, which is a word we've repeated in this conversation, will you acknowledge that that presence is really strongly there? And I think I've also talked about scale and density with objects in terms of my experience going through the art world and microaggressions and critique or different things like that. You would always have that person that says like, oh, why don't you get over it? That was such a long time ago. Move on. And in that regard, I also lend that to scale. Is imagine, you know, one tooth, oh, okay, doesn't look like much. 48 teeth, whoa, what do we have here? Like how many are like existing on this pile or within this space? And how do you do that without making someone want to move away from the conversation? So it's a balance too of not throwing in too much of like, whoa, 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 I can't stay here. But just offering enough intrigue that people will stay a little longer. And that's something I consistently work through within my practice, but there is a bit of intelligence that I think sometimes is not offered to our communities, is our ability to show you that we are intelligent and that we work through these layers with philosophy, with the science, and with the ability. I mean, I can coil like a, so I think in that regard, I appreciate the notion of the object, but the object in culture and my relation is also in collaboration with another human. It's like in collaboration with a community. So yeah, always in relation.
Okay, a thing that happened like moments before I started this Zoom call was that I was on the phone with Andy Moon, who teaches at Washington University, and she's been using Studio Potter to do discussion forums with her students. So she emailed me real quick some of their questions and thoughts. So you game for me to share those with you? So Maddie Singleton, she said, I really enjoyed reading this article because the author placed power into the clay and focused on the artist's response to it rather than their original intent. In my experience with filmmaking, the final product is never how I pictured it because the film is not solely reliant on me, the director. And if it was, then I would be doing the film a disservice. The changing factors in the process of making art is what gives the art such great value. However, there is still importance in shining your own light and identity through all of these changing factors. The question about whether an artist should always have to create pieces around their identity made me think, because I find it empowering and educational for artists to do so, but I do not want to burden other artists to teach me about their own identity. I wonder if artists want to stray away from their own identity, or does their personal connection to the piece strengthen the artwork? I was fascinated by the cell persona piece and want to ask Briggs, how do you know when you made the message clear enough for the viewer? When working with heavy topics like mass incarceration, do you want to make the message more clear so people can understand the artwork, or do you want to leave more of it up to interpretation?
Up until I did the first persona series, there was a persona series, and it just had to do with myself having moved to Minnesota and realizing that I was code switching a lot more than usual, and that I was performing a version of myself. And so persona was, I was looking at Jung about how much of ourselves do we share, and is the inside and outside. So there was gender involved with those pieces. And then cell persona. And so I was setting out to make those pieces work for myself. I'm really not trying to work on the viewer as much. I'm trying to make it work for me. So cell persona, when I realized that, first of all, I had this long history with incarcerated persons. So I don't really deal with that kind of subject matter. I hadn't for years, not in clay. You know, in my work, I found myself out there being involved, you know, with the issues. Or for some reason, when I did 2D work, it was always about some issue of representation. But in ceramics, by and large, it was a different type of question. So cell persona, again, it's such an uncomfortable topic for me. And like the movie 13th, Michelle Alexander's book, I don't know how some artists work with that content all the time. You know, it's hard for me. So I wasn't really that worried about the viewer. Again, I wanted to make something that felt like I felt inside, you know, that represented what I was thinking about, you know, that, yeah, I think that probably answers the question. I don't think I need to say more. I wasn't really going for the viewer as much as I was trying to represent something that when I looked at it, it echoed back to me how I was feeling about this crisis in our society, in my community.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you got it. So the next question is from Maya Cohen, and she wrote, "What struck me most about this article is the focus on creating art with a holistic approach. Each artist is using their identity to express their views to the world, but there are other components of each piece, such as the materials that were used and the current political climate in which the piece is being viewed. Shafkind touches on the importance of the materials we use in our art and thinking about where they come from. To me, this is a really important part of creating because every material has a direct impact on this earth. Choosing clay as a medium in and of itself is a statement, and the results of that needs to be considered in the creation of the piece. In addition to the effects of the medium on the world, Shafkind talks about the world's effect on each piece. Every piece is viewed in the context of the world at that time, which will change as the piece ages and can therefore change its meaning. So, is it fair of Shafkind to say that once a piece is fired, it cannot be reclaimed? Or is it possible that the piece is constantly changing based on the perspective it is being viewed from in the ever-changing setting of the world, and even though it can never be removed from this world, its footprint will continue to morph as time passes? So, Erin, do you want to tackle that?
There's a way that language is being used metaphorically. And so if we take it on as the metaphor, absolutely. What something means today compared to what it meant 100 years ago. Gosh, I just was watching with students this past week, Carrie James Marshall, talking about mastery, M-A-S-T-R-Y, going back to your word, Paul, that we need another word. And he talks about the old masters, and he's like, and that's problematic in itself. But he talks about Rubens painting these fleshy blonde ladies, and that then was what people were, what Rubens was exploring, and it's really a neat video that I showed to students this week, because I can say it's fair and it is not fair. It depending on what we deem as reclaim. You know, there's the reality of you can't reclaim something that's been fired, but does it have another meaning? Absolutely, absolutely. That, you know, that's just, it's like materiality and magic, you know, ephemeral. So I'm gonna answer that question with a yes and a no.
Courtney, Paul, do you have anything to add to that?
I did kind of, I don't know if it's necessarily adding to that, but I think it has to do with ultimately the notion of language, even when saying the word identity or the question previous to this, or the notion of reclamation. If someone, for instance, says, are you not including identity, or not acknowledging identity, or there was something about that previous question that I wanted to kind of go back to. If I did not offer anything to an audience, and I asked them to identify what Shinnecock is. I would be interested to know what the answers would be. Because in that regard, there is an assumption of the language of identity that is singular and not whole. And so that's something that I would ask of more, like asking a question back to the audience is, when you're saying the word identity in regards to a specific conversation, what already is in your head that's leading you towards the answer that you think may not be in the identity question that you're posing. And in that regard, I would put that into the same notion of reclamation or reclaiming. And I think that's where Erin was also acknowledging yes and no so the object for our community, for instance, all of like in our traditional pots, all of the language would be held in the neck or the mouth of the pot. We would not have any indentation on the body of the vessel. And it was held up here. And in terms of thinking about the vessel itself cannot have that language transcribed without the people. And so when we have an object that is moving through time, yes, once I die, if I haven't shared the narrative of where that story may have been marked, then that story is going to alter with the object, with the people. And I think in that regard, even the use of the word object is difficult culturally, because it is also something that is a living piece and living with the people and living with the time. And so it is of the time, but it is also living through the time. However it is held in that moment or period of reclaiming or identity, or but I mean, it's hard for me to just say I really love Paul's work without sounding like I'm, a fan or something, I guess, but I am, because to me, just based on looking at the work without knowing the narrative, there is an opening of the chest, there's tension, there's components of poetry within the shaping and shifting of space. Those are things that if you wanted to have a conversation about incarceration with this notion of identity, that you would miss out on the concept and the feeling of that breath. And that, I think, is something that we should be mindful as a society, that we're not just looking for an image of a person behind bars or the identity definition that we're looking for. And we miss out on the tension, the emotion, the evocativeness of the experience. And I don't, please, if I'm speaking out of context, Paul, please let me know, but that is just definitely something that I wanted to offer and acknowledge with what happens and what can be dangerous when having these conversations.
We have to talk more, because I am I am sitting at your feet tonight. I'm gaining so much. But when I wrote the Southeastern Minnesota grant to start that work, and when you go to the grant, you can go to the grant meeting and conversation. And so I'm sitting out there in the audience listening to them talk about the work. And, I like to study. And so I had written all this stuff about the work. And then when they were reviewing the application, they said, one of the criticisms of my proposal was, the artist has not said what the work will do. And I was like, man, absolutely. The work has to do something. And I don't know that I just knew that I wanted to capture that. So thank you, because some of the responses to the work have been, I don't know about that feeling as regards incarceration, but I know that feeling as regards being gay. You know, I know that feeling, you know, as regards to other things that they were going through in their life. So it did, yeah, it did. Yeah, I think their work has to capture something else you said that I think was quite brilliant when you talked about rolling coils. And I thought about that also. I was afraid that the work would be beautiful. I didn't want it to be beautiful. But there is something about fluency. Like, so it wasn't about virtuosity, but as you were talking about, your fluency with the material comes out into the work. And so, yeah, there's this beauty that just comes out because of the fluency with the material. And I don't know, here's a question for you. These are my words. There's something about the pieces also where when you're working like this, where I'm thinking, it definitely is more than an object, right? It's, I don't know, it becomes difficult. I don't even want to sell them to, I'm like, man, I'm not sure where I want this work to go and to be and to exist, you know, because of what's been put into it. Do you have that kind of experience? And
No, I sell, no, I'm just, no, okay, so I have a museum studies degree. When I first set out to study, I went to the Institute of American Indian Arts. I was supposed to be the first doctor in my family, so I took museum studies to say, I'm gonna be okay, family. And I fell in love with it. And when I did an internship at the Smithsonian in summer of '99, I was looking for documentation work from my community, what would have been in the collection. And I found a few things, but nothing that would ever be viewed on the floor. And I think if I to try to keep this short, the journey that I'm in right now is my way of activism is creating documentation that can sit within these spaces. But I also have learned that these spaces are problematic because they're not accessible to everyone. But digitally, they can be if the work is acquired and cataloged within that space. So I don't sign my work. That is something that I believe I strongly am wanting Shinnecock within the text, within the acknowledgement, within that space, because I don't feel that the work is mine alone to hold. And especially within the hub of Breach, I've traveled all over the world connecting with other coastal communities because I felt that our voice as Shinnecock people wasn't being heard or acknowledged. And if that was the case, I'm sure there were other coastal communities who were facing the same issues. And so I don't feel comfortable signing the narrative that's been shared with me as an experience. But yeah, so in my regard of the selling or I feel like it's going to exist on its own and it's going to do what it needs to do within that space. And you just, like for me, I just have to make it strong enough to exist on its own. And I feel that goes back to the humanity of the pieces. The work that's sitting behind you reads as a community. And in that regard, how do we as individuals exist on our own? And then how do we as individuals exist collectively? And yeah, the capitalistic system that we're existing in affords for a flight to Aotearoa when I had the opportunity, or a roof over my head. I don't own my own house, so it could be more lucrative. But in that regard, I think that's probably why I don't make work that I feel fits more within my community. So there are works that I make that are for like my family, and then there are works that I make that are for this space. Yeah, so I think there's a balance.
I wanted to read you this last one from Jade Wang. Jade says, this article encouraged me to think about identity and the role that it plays in art. A question Shafkind posed that stood out to me was, When artists create based on their identity, must they be fixed into that identity by the art community? I think that a lot of power can be reclaimed by those who choose to represent their identity through their art, especially when that identity is one that has been oppressed and discriminated against. I love what Courtney is doing in her art. By creating these weavings, she is revealing herself and history and presenting her most vulnerable self in her work while embracing and empowering herself through her Shinnecock Indian background. Is that incorrect to say that that way?
No,
Should it just be Shinnecock Nation?
well, I just say nation, but our community will say sometimes Shinnecock Indian Nation. I just don't like the word Indian, so it's to each his own. But
Okay, all right, I just wanted, all right. So I'm gonna start with, I love what Courtney is doing in her art by creating these weavings. She is revealing herself and history and presenting her most vulnerable self in her work. While embracing and empowering herself through her Shinnecock background, I find it disheartening that she has to receive questions such as, do you hunt buffalo and do you dig your own clay, when her art goes so much further than the stereotypes of her culture. As an answer to the question Shafkind posed, I think that artists are definitely not fixed into any one identity, and to restrict artists into a box so small is counterintuitive to what the art community should stand for. That just seemed like, I don't know, a good summation to our conversation.
honestly, I think so. I had a moment where I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna cry. I just appreciated the response because I think sometimes I wonder if people like understand it, and I think sometimes I'm constantly working my took us off because I feel like I'm shouting, but you can't shout because then you're the angry whatever. So it was nice to hear that somebody heard me, I think. And I think that's also something I want to acknowledge about this time. Like, thank you, Jill, thank you, Paul, thank you, Erin, for this space and the opportunity to be having these conversations. But I think I talked a bit about identity in response to that particular question, comment. And the do you hunt buffalo hasn't happened for a while, but the do you dig your own clay or do you fire traditionally is still an issue in terms of whether that makes your work worthy or not. And I think that that's also a very difficult conversation in terms of, in my practice, I talk about notions of false truth. So if I were to give you the idea of climate change that you're looking for, it would be the polar bear on the iceberg that's starving. Nobody actually knows that that particular polar bear is just a sick old bear. It wasn't actually that far from the iceberg. And I know this because of my Inupiaq friends that were like, that's just a sick bear. So the thing is that sometimes we're sold the narrative that we are seeking. And that narrative often is a false truth. And that false truth exists within ceramics in particular, and I own up to it. Unless you are digging your own material and knowing the responsibility to that relation to that space, you are a part of the construct of extraction. So I have a hard time when someone wants to place me within environmental art conversations or even environmental artists that are labeled that, because in that regard, we're talking about something as if we're separate from the system or we're separate from the responsibility, but we're not. So I never really get a chance to have these conversations, and I would love to have them more. And I think that that's something that ceramics also has to work on when we can get beyond technique and what did you use to glaze and what clay did you use for this and how did you fire it, and actually get to like, what are you talking about? And I think there's space for both, but I think there's a lot less space for what are you talking about? And in that conversation, what is the truth of it versus the false truth? So yeah, do you dig your own clay is so annoying. So I wish people would stop asking that, as if it's like it, because also how many of you on this panel have been asked, do you dig your own clay? Do you dig your own clay, Paul? Is that like, no, but just because I happen to be Indigenous, it's like this perceived identity question. So, so yeah, and it's come from the masters in the field growing up, because I've been in this field for pretty much my whole life. So I'm 40 now. Went to all the places you were supposed to go to, kind of to a certain degree, to study clay. But ignorance exists everywhere, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But yeah, thank you to whoever that person was for listening or for hearing me. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Thank you, Courtney. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I have never been asked if I dig my own clay. Never. But I start my students off when we're talking about their work. I say, all right, so first time we talk about your work, you know, as a group or one by, I don't want to hear what your medium is. I don't even want to know that. I want you to tell me what your ideas are. What are your ideas? Just talk to me about those ideas. We'll look at how you're speaking those ideas concretely. That's the next time around. But the first time around, let's just do the ideas. And I don't mind saying, after hearing Courtney say, the cell persona, see, because we do this to ourselves also. Because the cell persona is the first time that I made a group of pieces that wasn't clay that I made or glazes that I made up. I used what worked. You know, I couldn't use what I was going to pinch. I used what worked. And I almost drove myself crazy trying to make that black glaze. and then somebody said, didn't you get a grant? I said, just buy more of the glaze. But see, but we've done this number on ourselves, you know, also. And I think, wow. And then it comes out as even worse, right? When you start adding, you know, something to do with race and ethnicity and culture and being Indigenous. Yeah, it just comes out as, do you dig your own clay? And I've never been asked that, ever. So, wow. And I'm just, and I want to also say what Courtney has said. Thank you also for having this conversation. And I think also we've modeled here tonight also how you have these conversations. Right? You just can't be, you know, some of it you got to laugh about, or else you're going to cry. And also it's all about learning. There are some things that I'm going to talk about fluently, and there are some things that I'm going to put my foot in my mouth about, but we're just going to, you know, even saying that is probably not good, right? Putting my foot in my mouth. I'm going to learn as we talk more, right, about how to be in this world, you know, together. But we do have to enter this with a lot of openness. So thank you for providing the space for us to do so.
I'm really, really grateful to each one of you for being here and being willing to have this conversation. And Erin, thank you for bringing the article to light. I want to say, here's something that has occurred to me as we're talking, you know, the title, Reclaiming the Potter, and all this talk about identity, and just the word claiming like just a wrong premise. We just have to be and be open and to let other people be.
I'm going back to that other question with reclaim, and I wasn't thinking about the title of the piece with that question. So I just want to put in there that the title was really hard to get to, but it was more about how do we change? How do we transform? So going, I don't know if that question even applies really. We don't have to be raw clay. We don't have to be unfired clay to change. I just wanted to also just mention that for anybody out there who wants to write, that writing is a whole other way to approach this field of being part of the ceramics community. And I'm a huge proponent of it. And again, going back to who do you amplify and why, and that having met both Courtney and Paul, I'm just like, I don't know what it is when something vibrates or something goes bzzz, that both of them, and in different contexts at different conferences, you both resonated for me. I'm so grateful for that whatever that resonance was in your stories, if anything, it was more about the stories. I heard both of you talk, I think, before I even saw your art. And so that's just like a cool part about this strange world we're living in, where we do make objects, but I heard you both as people. It wasn't so much about the stuff, and then somehow the stuff also worked. Thank you both for the opportunity to get to write about you and to talk with you.
I just, for the reclamation component, I was just thinking about, okay, if we said claim, it could be authoritative, but if we look at the process of clay and shifting it through the transition of our coming to it, working through the malleability, positioning it, and then before moving forward, breaking it down and returning again, and then going through that motion again. There's a continuity of engagement and learning before moving forward. And I think in that regard, for the reclaiming the potter, is that to a certain degree, positions within this field moved forward before they even knew all the essence of learning that could have happened in that cycle. And then if I were to view the notion of reclamation or reclaiming in the regard of continuity of learning, then I would honor that definition and that title of this article as being conducive to the conversation that we're having versus a distance to claiming. It's more continuity of engagement and learning before we move forward thinking we know what we're talking about.
You are such a teacher, and you just brought me back to the conversation when we were circling around the title. Yes, that's exactly. I mean, didn't it come back for you, Erin? That's like exactly on the nose, Courtney. Yes, thank you. You guys, what a gift. Thank you. I appreciate each and every one of you. And I'm really glad to know your work, and I'm glad to know you as humans, and I'm so glad to be able to share your voices.
Likewise. Thanks, Jill,
Yeah.
Courtney, Erin. Thank you much.
Good night, you guys.